Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this honestly before you answer. When did you start accepting that your joints were just done? That waking up stiff, that wincing when you stand from a chair, that dull aching in your knees or your hands? When did you decide that was just part of getting older? Because most of my patients, when I ask them that question, they kind of pause, and then they say something like, "Well, I'm 68, doc. What do you expect?" Or, "My mother had bad knees too. It runs in the family." And I get that. I really do. We've been told, most of us, that joint pain after a certain age is inevitable. That cartilage wears down, that bones get brittle, that the body just deteriorates. And some of that is true. I'm not going to pretend aging doesn't involve real structural changes. But here's the thing that's been gnawing at me for years now. If arthritis and joint pain were purely about wear and tear, purely mechanical, then why do some of my 75-year-old patients have almost no joint pain, while some of my 58-year-olds can barely open a jar? Why does the pain come and go? Why does it flare after certain meals and not others? Why does someone's knee feel fine for 3 weeks and then suddenly feel like it's on fire for no apparent reason? Wear and tear doesn't work like that. Mechanical damage doesn't fluctuate with what you ate for dinner. And that's what led me, slowly, over many years of paying attention, to a connection that most doctors don't discuss with their patients. Not because it's fringe science, it's not, but because it requires a different way of thinking about pain. It requires you to consider the possibility that the source of your joint pain might not actually be in your joints at all. It might be in your gut. And the foods you eat every single day, foods you probably consider perfectly healthy, might be quietly fueling the inflammation that makes your body hurt. I know that sounds strange. Stay with me. I've been practicing internal medicine and gastroenterology for over 30 years. I've seen the way our understanding of the gut has evolved, and frankly, it's been one of the more humbling things I've witnessed in my career. 20 years ago, if a patient told me they thought their food was making their joints hurt, I probably would have nodded politely and moved on to something more conventional. I'm not proud of that, but it's honest. We weren't trained to connect those dots. The gut was for digestion. The joints were for orthopedics. Different departments, different specialists, different conversations. But the body doesn't work in departments. It never has. And the research over the last 15 or so years has made that painfully clear, no pun intended. So let me walk you through this carefully. Let me explain what's actually happening inside you in a way that I think will change how you understand your own pain. Let's start with your gut lining. Most people think of the gut as basically a tube. Food goes in, nutrients get absorbed, waste comes out. Simple plumbing. But the lining of your small intestine is anything but simple. It's a single layer of cells held together by what we call tight junctions. These junctions are remarkably selective. They're designed to let tiny, fully digested nutrient molecules through into your bloodstream while keeping everything else out. Bacteria, undigested food particles, toxins, all of that is supposed to stay inside the tube. Your gut lining is essentially a security gate, and when it's working properly, it's extraordinarily good at its job. But here's what happens with age, and this is the part that I wish more doctors talked about openly. That lining gets thinner. The tight junctions become less tight. The mucus layer that protects those cells gets thinner too. Blood flow to the gut lining decreases. The immune cells that patrol the gut become less precise. They start overreacting to things they used to ignore. This is a natural part of aging, yes. But it means that by the time you're 60 or 65, your gut barrier is not what it was at 35. It's more vulnerable, more permeable, more likely to let things through that shouldn't get through. And that's essentially what leaky gut means. I know that term has become somewhat controversial. Some of my colleagues roll their eyes when they hear it, and I understand why it's been co-opted by people selling supplements and miracle cures, and that's unfortunate. But the underlying concept, increased intestinal permeability, is well documented in medical literature. It's real, it's measurable, And it's more common in older adults than most people realize. Now, what does this have to do with your knees, with your hands, with that shoulder that aches every morning? Everything, potentially. When the gut barrier becomes too permeable, particles that were never meant to enter your bloodstream start getting through. Fragments of bacteria, partially digested proteins, compounds from food that your immune system doesn't recognize. And your immune system, which is already a bit jumpy in older age, we call that immunosenescence, this gradual shift toward a more inflammatory baseline, your immune system sees those particles and sounds the alarm. It mounts an inflammatory response, not a big dramatic one, not like an infection, but a low-grade, chronic, simmering kind of inflammation that circulates through your entire body. And here's the critical part. That inflammation doesn't stay in your gut. It travels through your blood, to your joints, to your tendons, to the synovial membranes that cushion your bones. Joints are particularly vulnerable because they have rich blood supply and sensitive tissue that reacts strongly to inflammatory signals. So what started as a breakdown in your intestinal lining ends up manifesting as pain, swelling, and stiffness in places that seem completely unrelated to digestion. I had a patient, I'll call her Doris, 71 years old, lovely woman, came to see me not for gut problems, but because her rheumatologist was frustrated. Her rheumatoid markers were borderline. Her x-rays showed some arthritis, but nothing that fully explained her level of pain. She was on 2 anti-inflammatories and still hurting. And when I talked to her, really talked to her, not just reviewed her chart, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she'd also been dealing with bloating and irregular bowel habits for years. She said she didn't bring it up because she figured it was just a stomach thing, separate from the joint pain. It wasn't separate. When we started looking at her diet, her daily eating patterns, something became very clear. She ate wheat-based products at almost every meal, toast in the morning, sandwich at lunch, pasta or bread with dinner, and she snacked on crackers throughout the day. She also loved tomatoes, peppers, and beans, foods that are generally considered healthy, and they are for many people. But for Doris, at her age, with her gut integrity already compromised, those foods were likely contributing to a cycle she didn't know existed. Let me explain why. Gluten, the protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, has a well-documented effect on a molecule called zonulin. Zonulin regulates those tight junctions I mentioned earlier. When zonulin levels increase, the tight junctions loosen. The gut becomes more permeable. Now, in someone with celiac disease, this effect is dramatic and dangerous. But even in people without celiac disease, gluten can increase zonulin to a degree. The research on this has been growing. It's not settled, and I want to be honest about that. But the mechanism is plausible, and I've seen it play out clinically more times than I can count. Then there are lectins. Lectins are proteins found in many plants. They're concentrated in things like beans, lentils, certain grains, nightshade vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes. Lectins serve as a defense mechanism for the plant. They're not easily digested, and in some people, they can irritate the gut lining directly. They can bind to the cells of the intestinal wall and contribute to that increased permeability. Again, this doesn't mean everyone who eats a tomato is going to get leaky gut. Most younger people handle lectins just fine, but in an older gut, one that's already thinning, already more fragile lectins can be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. And Doris was eating all of these, every day, consistently, not because she was careless, because nobody told her not to. Because these are foods that appear on every healthy eating list you've ever seen. And for a 30-year-old with a robust gut lining, they probably are healthy. But the body at 71 doesn't process food the way it did at 31. That's not a weakness, it's biology. Now let me tell you what happened with Doris, because I think her experience is instructive. We didn't do anything drastic. I didn't put her on some extreme elimination diet. I didn't take her off her medications. What I suggested, carefully, was a period of observation. I asked her to keep a simple food and symptom journal for 3 weeks. Just write down what she ate and how her joints felt later that day and the next morning. Nothing fancy, no apps, just a notebook. When she came back, the pattern was right there on the page. Her worst mornings, the ones with the most stiffness, the most pain, consistently followed days when she had eaten the most bread, pasta, and nightshade vegetables. Not every single time. The body isn't that neat. But the pattern was unmistakable. That's what I mean when I say this is about patterns, not single meals. I want to talk now about why the standard approach often falls short. When most seniors go to their doctor for joint pain, what happens? They get an X-ray, maybe blood work. They're told they have osteoarthritis, or wear and tear, or maybe an autoimmune component. They're given anti-inflammatories, maybe a steroid injection. If it's bad enough, they're referred for surgery. And those interventions have their place. I'm not dismissing them. Pain management matters. Joint replacement saves people's quality of life. I've referred patients for those things, and I'd do it again. But here's my frustration. Nobody looks at the gut. Nobody asks what they're eating every day. Nobody considers that the inflammation driving their pain might have a source that can be addressed, not just masked. Anti-inflammatories suppress the inflammatory signal, but they don't ask why the signal is there in the first place. And if the source is intestinal permeability triggered by daily dietary exposure, then the pain will keep coming back, because you're treating the smoke detector, not the fire. Let me talk about a second patient. I'll call him Walter, 63, retired postal worker, big guy, solid build. Came to me with what he called whole body pain. His hands, his hips, his lower back. He'd been told it was a combination of osteoarthritis and age. He was taking ibuprofen almost daily, and his stomach was starting to suffer because of it, which, by the way, is its own irony. Anti-inflammatory drugs like NSAIDs can actually damage the gut lining with chronic use. So, you take them for joint pain, and they make your gut more permeable, which potentially makes the inflammation worse over time. It's a cycle that nobody warns you about. Walter was also dealing with acid reflux, which he'd had for years, and loose stools that he just chalked up to sensitive digestion. When I suggested we look at his gut health in connection with his joint pain, he was skeptical. I appreciated that. Skepticism is healthy, but he was also tired of hurting, so he was willing to try something different. And that's when I introduced what I think of as a gut repair approach. It's not a protocol in the strict medical sense. I don't want to oversell it. But it's a framework that I've used with many patients over the years, and it has 3 basic components. Let me walk through them. The first step is the hardest, honestly. It involves reducing your exposure to the foods most likely to increase intestinal permeability. For most people, that means pulling back on gluten-containing grains and being mindful of high-lectin foods. I don't tell people to eliminate everything overnight. That's unrealistic, and it causes unnecessary stress. What I suggest is a gradual reduction. Start with breakfast. If you're eating toast every morning, try switching to oatmeal steel cut, not instant or eggs. If you're having a sandwich for lunch every day, try it as a salad with the same fillings but no bread, a few times a week. Small shifts, sustainable ones. With lectins, I usually suggest reducing raw nightshades and seeing how you feel. Cooking tomatoes and peppers reduces their lectin content significantly, by the way. So it's not about never eating a tomato again. It's about preparation and quantity. Pressure cooking beans, for instance, eliminates most of their lectin content. These aren't extreme measures. They're just more thoughtful ways of preparing food. And the key during this phase is paying attention. That's really what step 1 is about, reducing exposure and observing what changes. Some people notice a difference in their joint pain within 2 to 3 weeks. Others take longer. Some notice changes in their digestion first, less bloating, less gas, more regular bowel movements, and the joint improvements come later. Everyone's timeline is different, but the observation is what matters. You're learning your own body's responses. The second step is actively supporting the repair of the gut lining, and this is where bone broth enters the conversation. I know bone broth has become trendy, and whenever something becomes trendy, I get a little wary. But the truth is, bone broth has been used in traditional diets for centuries, long before anyone was selling it in fancy packaging, and there's good reason for that. When you simmer bones, chicken, beef, whatever you prefer for an extended period, you extract collagen, gelatin, glycine, proline, and glutamine. These aren't exotic nutrients. They're amino acids that your body uses specifically to maintain and repair the mucosal lining of your gut. Glycine, for instance, has well-documented anti-inflammatory properties. Glutamine is the preferred fuel source for the cells of your small intestine. They use it more than glucose, which is something most people find surprising. For seniors especially, this matters, because as you age, your body produces less collagen naturally. Your ability to repair mucosal surfaces slows down. Providing those building blocks directly, through something as simple as a cup of bone broth, gives your gut lining what it needs to rebuild itself. I usually suggest 1 cup a day, warmed, maybe in the morning or as an afternoon drink. Some of my patients add it to soups or use it as a cooking base. It doesn't have to be complicated. I'll be honest, I wasn't always a bone broth believer. It sounded too simple, too folksy. But I've watched patients improve on it consistently enough that I can't dismiss it. Walter, the postal worker I mentioned, started having a cup of homemade bone broth every morning. Within about 6 weeks, his reflux had diminished noticeably, and he told me his hands didn't feel as thick in the mornings. His word, not mine. That's not a controlled clinical trial, but it's a man who felt better, and that matters. The third step is restoring microbial balance in the gut. Your gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that live in your intestinal tract, plays a massive role in maintaining gut barrier integrity, regulating immune responses, and controlling inflammation. And the microbiome changes significantly with age. Diversity decreases, beneficial species decline. Opportunistic, pro-inflammatory species can gain ground. This shift is well established in the research. Probiotics can help rebalance things, but I want to be measured about this. The probiotic industry is enormous, and not all products are created equal. What I generally recommend is a multi-strain probiotic that includes lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species taken consistently. Not megadoses, not 17 different supplements. One reasonable quality probiotic taken daily with food, and alongside that, feeding those bacteria with the right foods. Prebiotic fibers from things like cooked onions, garlic, asparagus, bananas, oats provide fuel for beneficial bacteria to thrive. You don't need a special powder, you just need to eat these foods regularly. Consistency matters far more than perfection here. Taking a probiotic for 3 days and then stopping because you didn't feel different immediately, that's not going to accomplish anything. Your microbiome took decades to reach its current state. Shifting it in a meaningful way takes weeks to months of steady, gentle effort. I want to come back to something I said earlier, because I think it's important. This is not about curing arthritis. I would never claim that. Arthritis is a complex condition with structural, genetic, immunological, and mechanical components. What I'm talking about is addressing one contributor, intestinal permeability, and the systemic inflammation it drives that is often overlooked entirely. If reducing gut-derived inflammation takes your pain from an 8 to a 5, isn't that worth exploring? If it means you can reduce your ibuprofen from daily to occasional, isn't that meaningful? I think it is. I had another patient, a woman I'll call Margaret, 64. She came to me not because of joint pain, interestingly, but because of persistent fatigue and brain fog. But as we talked, she mentioned her knees had been bothering her for years, and she'd also developed new food sensitivities in her late 50s. Things she used to eat without trouble were now causing bloating and discomfort. That combination, new food sensitivities, joint pain, fatigue, and cognitive sluggishness, is one I've come to recognize as a cluster. And very often, when I see that cluster in a senior, intestinal permeability is part of the picture. Margaret was resistant to changing her diet at first. She told me, "I've eaten this way my whole life. Why would it be a problem now?" And that's such a fair question. The answer is that your gut lining at 64 is not your gut lining at 34. The barrier has changed. The microbiome has changed. The immune system has changed. Foods that were perfectly fine before can become problematic, not because the food changed, but because you did. That's a hard thing to hear. But I think most people, when it's explained clearly, can understand it. Margaret did eventually try the approach I described, gradually reduced her wheat and gluten intake, started making bone broth on Sundays and drinking it through the week, added a probiotic, and after about 2 months, she reported something that surprised even her. Her knees felt better. Not perfect, but noticeably, consistently better, and the brain fog had lifted somewhat too. She told me, "I feel like I got 10% of myself back." 10% might not sound like a lot, but when you've been feeling diminished for years, 10% feels like a gift. I want to close by saying something that I feel strongly about. Pain is not just a symptom to be suppressed. Pain is information. It's the body's way of telling you something is wrong. And when that pain is chronic, when it persists despite treatment, I think we owe it to ourselves, and I owe it to my patients to look deeper, to ask uncomfortable questions about what we're eating, how our gut is functioning, and whether the fire behind the smoke is something we can actually address. This isn't about blame. Nobody chose to develop a permeable gut lining. Nobody deliberately ate their way into inflammation. But once you understand the connection, once you see how your gut, your immune system, and your joints are all talking to each other, you have the opportunity to intervene in a way that's gentle, practical, and potentially quite meaningful. You don't need to overhaul your entire life. You don't need to buy expensive supplements. You don't need to follow some extreme protocol you read about online. What you need is awareness, patience, and a willingness to observe your own body more carefully than you have before. If anything I've said today resonated with you, if you've had that experience where your joint pain seems to come and go for no obvious reason, or where your digestion and your pain seem oddly connected, I'd like to hear about it. Leave a comment. Share your experience. Not because I can diagnose you through a screen, but because these stories help other people recognize patterns in their own lives, and sometimes that recognition is the first step toward feeling better. Thank you for your time today. Take care of your gut. It's doing more for you than you probably realize, and your joints will thank you for it.